Mellissa, thank you so much for joining us. For anybody watching on video, they might be wondering why we're sat at a cricket ground when your background is in rowing, but we've had a great couple of days here at the Sport Positive Summit. How was it for you?
Yeah, for anyone who knows me, they'll know that I'm really terrible with hand-eye coordination, so that would be a swift shift round from rowing to cricket. But yeah, absolutely loved the summit. So I guess I've been attending it for the last 3 or 4 years, but we had a couple of years with COVID, and I remember last year was a big moment of getting 400 sport and climate focused people together in person at Wembley, and then to repeat it again this year was just fantastic. So good couple of days. Yeah.
Obviously the focus here was around climate change and sustainability, and that's the focus of a lot of your work as well. Before we get specifically into that, I'm interested in the transition that you made as an athlete from competing and focusing on personal goals, I guess, to something a bit wider than that, which is what this podcast is all about.
Yeah, so my background was as a rower. I took up rowing when I got to uni, and I had actually really stayed kind of well at arm's length from sport growing up. I was voted at my school most likely to become a librarian, and I got to uni and thought I was down in Cambridge, a beautiful river running through it, and I thought, that looks like a relaxing way to spend time. And I guess it doesn't feel totally unrelated that I then ended up working in climate, because I spent the next 7, 8, 9 years out in most conditions, most days, becoming increasingly aware of some of the shifts in climate that we're now seeing more and more regularly. But I took my time realising how much there was going on between sport and sustainability, certainly, because actually by 2020 I'd completed a fair amount of training to becoming an environmental lawyer, and that had been prompted by my time in rowing, because, as I say, of noticing the climate impacts, being out in sometimes these absolutely beautiful moments where the sun's rising, it's like 5 a.m, so you've really got to appreciate why you're there and the space you're in. And so I'd kind of increasingly been directed towards how I wanted to engage with climate, but I thought that was going to be down a legal route. I was really excited by and still am excited, but watching more from afar at the opportunities that law presents to kind of pull levers and shift how we're engaging with climate. But as I said, it's really in 2020 that I grew to appreciate just how much was going on within sport and climate. I'd been selected for the Tokyo Olympics in March 2020, and then 3 days later the games got postponed. And I mean, maybe we'll chat a bit more about that piece, but it really pushed a lot of things into flux for me, because I've been so focused down onto this moment this summer. And actually, psychologically, I was thinking very much of that being the point at which I finished my rowing career and started engaging with sustainability through law full time. And once the Olympics were postponed, I ended up, it just created a bit of space for me to start to realise and appreciate how much was already going on connecting sustainability to sport. And at that moment it felt like it made a lot more sense actually to continue building within the sector that I'd spent a decade in, and engaging through that avenue with sustainability, rather than trying to kind of activate a whole new professional pathway. So that's kind of how some of that shift happened.
So that was a pivotal moment that probably at the time felt like your world kind of collapsing around you, I guess, when you worked so hard towards competing in the Olympics, and then that situation. But actually, it turns out, whether it's because of your mindset or what, you've turned it into something really positive and something transformational for you.
Yeah, it was awful. I'd and I think it probably sounds really over dramatic in some ways to frame it like that, but when you are training full time for a particular outcome, and you're putting a lot of the rest of your life on hold. I mean, I hadn't attended a wedding in years. Even funerals were they felt like a bit of a tussle about whether you were going to go or not. You were 3 times a day most days, really ending yourself physically and mental pressure comes into that in a big way as well. And I remember one of my best friends, Hol, who was also on the team with me, saying in that kind of February-March 2020 period, I remember her drawing an analogy to how you feel when you're coming towards an end of a race in rowing, and we race over 2 kilometres, so in that last 100 metres, your eyes are closed, your teeth are gritted, your whole body's pain. Your whole body's been pain from close on to the start of the race, but you're 6 or 7 minutes into that by that point, and you just close your eyes and drive for the line with all you've got, but you're kind of in this shutdown mode, and I remember I think a fair number of us were almost at that point come March 2020 for various reasons. And I remember Hall saying to me, look, we're in that last 100 metres and everything feels like pain, but we've just got to shut our eyes and the line will come. And so to be selected in that March period and then have the postponement announced 3 days later, I think for some people, and I was a relatively young athlete, I guess, as I said, having started sport just when I got to uni, in some ways a decade should have been enough for me to have a kind of professional attitude and be in a better mental space maybe, but it just, for a variety of circumstances, where I was in that March period, I was kind of at end point, and so to have then the postponement, it didn't feel like this is just one extra 12 months in the course of a decade-long Olympic campaign. This was like somebody leaning over in those 100 metres and saying, oh, just kidding, you've actually got another 2 kilometres to go, and you're not set up to achieve that. And so by that point, actually, I had a bulging disc in my back. I then ended up with a fractured rib and a fractured foot and an iron infusion, all in like a 2-3 month period. And so it really was, it was a proper low point. And so exactly as you say, to then within that time start to realise that there was this real growth opportunity in terms of the impact that I could derive from my time in sport, was huge. And I think that quite a few of my friends, I'm not unique by any means in having had in some ways a fairly difficult experience within that point in sport and then my kind of the end of my sporting career, but I think one of the things that I feel really fortunate in is that for some of my friends, that was the end point of their relationship with sport, whereas for me over the last few years I feel like that there's just been a continuation of many of the really powerful good things that I had within sport, and I can see and appreciate a thread that runs through, taking me right from all those difficult experiences through to the work I do now, and so I think that's been just immensely powerful for me on a personal sense, I guess. Yeah.
So what's driving you now, Mellissa? Is it because previously you saw these two things as separate, sporting achievements or a sporting career, and then, as you said before, you saw an opportunity to go into environmentalism after that? Do you now see that you were missing something by not linking those two things together at the time?
I do see that, but I think that what's driving me probably is firstly just incommunicable levels of concern about our direction of travel regarding climate and a need to address that, and then a real belief that sport is one of the most powerful ways that we're going to get people engaging and taking action on it. And so I mentioned near the beginning about the opportunity I felt there was within law and litigation to push that change. But actually, when once the kind of dust settled for me a bit in terms of my own relationship with sport, seeing the fact that it holds this absolutely unique cultural space, bringing together millions and often billions of people in high emotion moments where they have a real sense of belonging, that sometimes I think we, within this space, I can get sucked into the facts and stats and figures about the numbers of people, but I think for me it's that second piece even more. It's the fact that when it's not just the numbers, it's the fact that when those numbers of people are brought together, they're getting behind moments in which individuals are sizing up to huge challenges and things that scare them, and they're doing so with ambition and urgency, camaraderie, courage, and I think it's all of those, it's that value piece that for me is a real key to unlocking sport and sports opportunity here, because those are exactly the same approaches that we need in order to deliver the change that we have to achieve in a climate sense. And if we're able to create that joining between the way athletes are just humans, the people who spend a lot of time, in my case, a lot of time rowing backwards around a fairly big pond, and they practice as well honing those particular skills around being ambitious and determined and resilient. But they are just people, and I think the more that we can use that to accelerate the kind of development and actioning of those qualities on a kind of societal sense, that's the real thing that excites me about sport, and the reason why I chose to continue within sport when focusing on climate.
I really want to ask you a little bit more about how you go about doing that, but first of all, just to wind back a little bit, when you mentioned belonging and the power of sport to do that, tell me a bit about your story. Having come into sport late, what did it give you that you didn't have previously, maybe?
Yeah, I remember that I was fairly cynical, having been really unsporty at school. I had a really sporty younger brother. I've got two younger brothers, but one was super, super sporty. And I remember I just didn't get it, or I chose not to get it. It was like, I probably could see what it offered. I saw what the girls in my school got out of their sports teams, and the guys as well. But I think I chose to dismiss it and discount it because I just couldn't see a way of me accessing it. And to be able to get to uni and discover that. I remember actually a particular moment standing, because I ended up learnt rowing at Cambridge, and then after a year started participating in the kind of university boat race system, and it's its own really quirky little world. But I remember there being a moment standing on the Putney embankment with my crew, my team, and actually just catching myself. I probably wasn't giving as much attention as I ought to have been to what the coach was saying, because I suddenly just thought, I'm actually part of a team. And the boat race is a weird event because you end up, you're university athletes, you're kind of spending your time focused on a fair number of things, but then suddenly it comes to April and you're being watched by, I think, something like 5 million people, and you've got helicopters going overhead. And I actually remember this friend Hull, we had a practice the day before our first boat race that was on, because I was there during the transition from the women's event used to be held in Henley with maybe, if we were lucky, 1,000 people attending. It was a really small scale. And then 2015 it moved to the Tideway alongside the men's, and I remember we were part of that first crew, and I remember coming under the Putney Bridge the day before the race, and so we're trying to really hone the level of professionalism that we're going to be displaying and the composure that we're going to be bringing to the race line the following day. And I remember my friend Hall, the Cox, was saying, now imagine the helicopters, imagine the noise, you got thousands of people lining the banks. And I remember my best friend Hall turning around and just going I don't think I responded particularly well. It was like, but yeah. So anyway, there was a lot of that belonging in a way that I just had never experienced, and I guess that's one of the things probably that I know that sport has in some ways a uniqueness to it. It's not the only way of bringing people together. People who are in the healthcare system or police or things like that. I mean, there's camaraderie to be found in all sorts of different places in our society. But having not had that growing up, really, I guess that's been a really helpful experience for me to then draw on and say, look, yeah, let's use that in how we're relating sport and climate.
That's so interesting. I guess everybody, it's a basic human need, isn't it? That sense of belonging, to not be left behind and to be part of something bigger than yourself. It's such a powerful tool in this space.
Yeah, and it's what we really need when we're facing something the size of climate. I think it almost more than any social issue. I mean, I guess it sits alongside kind of diversity and equality issues and things like that. Like, we need to be coming together to tackle those. But when we look at something like, I guess I'm just thinking immediately of mental health, that we need a system in place to support people, but it also has a kind of individual strand, I think. I'm happy to be checked and challenged on that. But for climate, it's enormous. I think a lot of us, when we think of climate change, our minds turn to things like the forest fires, flooding. I end up often thinking of those wave coming towards us, and I think if we don't have that sense of belonging, it's very easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of what needs to be accomplished. So I totally agree with you. It's vital here.
Well, it has the power to bring people together, but of course it has the power to divide people as well in sport. And a part of, and when you're dealing with athletes in particular, you're talking to people with an inherent competitive mindset. And I guess one of the issues with getting a climate message out there and getting people to really care and really action on it is that they look after themselves first, and it's like, okay, how can this benefit me? How do you go about, when you engage initially with athletes, making that shift from a competitive mindset to a collaborative one? Is that a challenge?
I actually haven't found it to be so, and I think that probably stems from the fact that a lot of our the campaigns that we've drawn together. I founded this non-profit, Athletes of the World, with my co-founder Hannah Mills, who's an Olympic sailor, and I think we always form our campaigns around the qualities and the values of sport, really, and I think that has a degree of cut through. Sometimes I think it's really clever to incorporate competitiveness, and I see that playing out in there are several, for example, several fan-focused football non-profits and charities that can allow, say, Spurs and Chelsea fans to compete on which fan group is creating most behaviour changes within their group and lifestyle, things like that. But I think when we're looking to bring athletes behind our campaigns, when we centre it about what that sport is really about, that has a kind of cut through that reaches whether you're an individual athlete or you're part of a team, but you see that one of your competitor teams is signing the letter or participating in the video or whatever. An example of this would be that we've twice now engaged rugby players from right across from UK, England, Scotland, Australia, Kiwi players, and also Pacific Island nations, players from Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, behind climate-focused reports and letters saying, look, some of our core rugby nations are those Pacific Islanders who are facing immediate climate impacts like rising sea levels, impacts on their GDP, and we as rugby are known for camaraderie, integrity, pushing to the final whistle, standing shoulder to shoulder. I think when you tap into moments like that, very few rugby players are going to say, oh, well, I'm an individual here first and foremost, because actually, like all of us in society, we're playing within a system that no one is actually an individual, whether it's within sport or within our kind of civil society. And so I think, that would be the same when we were looking at, we wrote a letter to the UK government that had 300 GB Olympians and Paralympians back it. And there as well, it was saying, look, we're a country that's really good at prioritising excellence in sport and the legacy aspect that goes along with that. But where legacy is really going to count and where leadership is going to really count is in a climate context. And so let's channel that. And I think when your messaging is focused in that way, very few athletes see it as a moment for competition. Maybe they get narked about whether they're first in the press release or whether they're getting most attention. But actually, I think one of the things we're more likely to encounter is reticence from individual athletes about being the only one to speak. So that's one of the core reasons why we've consistently brought many athlete voices together behind something, because this is not an individual issue, but also it's not the job of any one athlete to raise the head above a parapet. This is something that affects us all and that many, many, many people care about. So bringing those voices collectively together just makes sense on multiple levels.
There was some interesting discussion around that at the Sport Positive Summit about collective action and the responsibility maybe and the power of commercial partners such as sportswear brands in activating their sponsorships and commercial activity alongside athletes around this. How can athletes engage with that collaborative action and maybe push their sponsorships and commercial partnerships in that direction?
Yeah, it's an immensely complex one, I think, because another piece, one of the keynotes from Claire Poole, who founded Sport Positive, the summit that we've just been at, in one of the final addresses, she made the point that we can't have unlimited growth with finite resources. We live on a finite planet, and I think that partnership with brands always comes up against that for athletes that are wanting to engage meaningfully in the climate and sustainability space. Trying to dig down into whether brands are genuinely providing solutions and applying sports values around excellence and ambition meaningfully and with full integrity. That feels like a key opportunity. Great, match made in heaven, athletes get behind it and there's real alignment and kind of purpose-led approach. What concerns me is the flip side of it doesn't take much imagination to recognise the power of sport as a marketing tool for getting brands noticed and getting buy-in from fans and the rest of society. Even in my spectacularly non-sporty, non-coordinated days, I could still really get behind an Olympic Games or particularly football match or whatever, just as a fan and as a viewer. So I think it troubles me that this is a bit of athletes, I guess, have to be really savvy, and the agents working with them have to be really savvy, and the organisations like our own have to help where we can in really drilling down into what the brands concerned are really seeking to do and what answers they have to the questions about what's your vision for the future? Is it about growth in terms of sales? And is that because you think that your product is providing a solution long term to climate issues we face in terms of resource use and waste and things like that? Or what are your answers to that question? Because if they don't have good ones, then I don't think it's a brilliant idea.
So through Athletes of the World, then you engage with individual athletes. Do they come to you? Do you seek them? How does that relationship work begin?
Yeah, there's been a variety of pathways over the last few years. So I guess initially it was very much a case of seeking athletes out directly, and full disclosure, because Hannah's a double Olympic champion, most successful female Olympic sailor ever. So she has a nice blue tick on her Instagram account. But Hannah also in 2021, as this enormously successful athlete who didn't have a dodgy back, so was going to the Tokyo Games, was super busy, and so I actually took over. This is terrible to admit, but I for a little while I was managing Hannah's Instagram account.
You were moonlighting.
Yeah, you're the first person to. This better not be the title under which this podcast goes out. Because, and I mean, we were transparent. I did say I'm Mellissa and I'm working with Hannah, but we messaged athletes directly on Instagram saying, look, we're really concerned at this point. Our first proper focus together was ahead of COP26 summit, and we ended up with Olympic flag bearers from 50 different countries coming together in a video to world leaders. We had athletes like Tom Daley and Eliud Kipchoge, Andy Murray, and so at first we were very much, I mean, Athletes of the World wasn't a registered non-profit. It was myself and Hannah trying to work out how we brought other athletes like ourselves behind campaigns. So at first it was based on a lot of direct approaches, the power of contacting your immediate friends who are athletes and then seeing where it goes. But then I guess as time progressed and we moved into being a more formal organisation, it then one of our focuses grew to be how we work with other sports organisations. So we developed a relationship with the Commonwealth Games when it's hosted in Birmingham, with Team GB and UK Sport, individual sports like Formula E, a top Premier League football team, so that we could bring athletes together collectively, especially around climate education, because one of the things that we felt was there was a gap where there are certain societal issues. I think athletes are doing a brilliant job increasingly on engaging with impact-focused issues, but the more immediate issues to engage with, to me, often seem to be around, and all of these are really important, and I'm so glad that the work is being done on them, but equality, well-being, mental health, and I think there's a quite understandable bridge to cross around athletes engaging with climate, because for most of us, climate feels like an issue that it's necessary to have more scientific knowledge. There's lots of misinformation because there are a lot more vested interests pushing that out. There's a concern always around hypocrisy because of athlete travel and things like that, in a way that just doesn't exist for an athlete talking about mental health, for example. And so for us, it was really necessary to start creating resources that could help cross that bridge, form that bridge, so that athletes grew to feel that actually climate sits right in sports wheelhouse, because we need a safe, prospering environment in which to participate in sport, whether that's at grassroots or elite level, and actually also telling the story of how most of the other things we care about are also reliant on that safe, secure, planetary environment for us all to be in. So it felt like the best way for us to do that was by working with some organisations, bringing athletes together who are already teammates or familiar with one another or facing the same event, because often when coming across, I found myself, I have quite a lot of climate books and literature and resources on my shelf or on my Netflix account or whatever it is, that it takes me an awful long time to actually engage with, because I'm always worried that it's going to be a bit of a Pandora's box, and you open it not knowing how devastating content's going to be. Yeah. And often actually once I do it, most of the time people are really good at providing the solutions, showing the way. I tend to feel better having read something than worse, but I think there's a bit of our psyche that's really good at protecting us from things that we think might be difficult and hard. So one of the things for us was bringing athletes together and making sure that we formed relationships with their sports organisations so that they were going to be supported after the education or the training or whatever we were offering, and didn't feel like, okay, now I appreciate the problem and I appreciate the opportunity that athletes have to engage with it, but where do I go from here? So I guess for us it started with individual athletes and it grew to bringing athletes together, often with the support of their sports body, and now we do a bit of both. So we are working with some pockets of athletes through sports where it just happens that at a similar time multiple swimmers, for example, will get in touch with us, or within the space of a few months, and we'll think, oh, maybe it'd be nice to start a bit of an organic group with them, so that they can, because for any, Hannah and I can have ideas about what will work in different sports, but the people who are by far best placed to do that are the footballers or the tennis players or the sailors or the swimmers. And so for us, part of it has been about forming those connections as well. So different ways, seeing what works as we go in some ways.
I think a really interesting point that you touched on there is building that bridge between activism and people's day-to-day realities. On one hand, dealing with the facts of climate change is overwhelming for a lot of people, and it's a scary concept, and it's one that, like you said, Pandora's box, people prefer to just keep that closed. And then the other is a sense of hypocrisy, that if you actually do engage with this, yet it's a threat to the way that you currently live your life, and your values and your views on things. How do you meaningfully engage with it in a practical and realistic way? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think a lot of people struggle with that. I know I do, being honest. It's like, okay, what practical steps can I actually take here without never driving my car again, never catching another flight again. And athletes do face those challenges, especially when they can be criticised for being hypocritical as well. So it's a difficult space, I guess, for them to enter. Yeah. And working with an organisation like yours and having those conversations that you touched on there, presumably can help them navigate that bridge, if you like.
Yeah. What a huge question or observation. It's so true that most of us feel, I think, as it almost as soon as you try to take the blinkers off that we all in kind of self-preservation mode put on, you're faced with all of those questions about what, so I never drive, what can I possibly eat, because do I have to grow it in my own garden, and easier by far just to say, okay, I'm just going to give myself the comfortable, easy reasons why I should keep doing as I'm doing. I think one of the things for me, I guess personally, and what I think we then try to draw out when we're engaging athletes and doing the work we're doing is that the answers for me often lie in returning to lessons I learnt when I was rowing. So one of the pieces that I often shift back to when I'm feeling overwhelmed about this, or where do I possibly go from here, is that when we were in our races or in our erg tests or wherever we were, if I'm qualifying the boat for Tokyo Olympics, again and again we'd be practicing and implementing, focusing on a single stroke at a time. So you take maybe oh, my maths is so terrible. You're taking either hundreds or thousands of strokes over the course of the race, and each one's painful, and each one you wish the line was already here and then everything was over, and you've got all of this pressure and all of this fear that you could lock into, especially because in rowing you can't even see where your competitors are, so you're really just getting a great view of the back in front, provided that your eyes aren't already closed, and And all we'd be practicing is that one controllable, which is how you take that next stroke. And one of the sports psychologists that we worked with used to talk about psychologically placing a trampoline at the end of the course. So anytime your brain went to the finish line, that trampoline bounced your thoughts straight back to that place that you're in, and the next stroke you're going to take. And so I frequently return to that when faced with all of these unknowns and the scale of what we're trying to do here, and just think, right, well, what is the most ambitious thing that I can do next, which is all any of us can do. And I think as well, I remember fairly early on when I was just trying to acclimatise to what it was to try to aspire to go to an Olympic Games, and feeling fairly overwhelmed about that given my rubbish sporting history. I remember somebody else giving me a really short book, and I wish I could properly credit it for this, but a quote in it was saying, I remember writing it down, it just said, real surfers always seek out the biggest waves. And that as well I just loved, because it feels like climate is one of those. And I spoke earlier about that idea of when we envisage climate, we think of the climate disasters often that we see unfolding or that we fear, and my image of this big wave. And for me, it feels like engaging in this way is about, rather than just looking at it, or what I sometimes also end up doing is just like shutting your eyes to it, not opening the climate books that are on my bookshelf. Actually, what this is about is turning your surfboard back round, or if you don't have a surfboard, just your body round, so that you're ready to run with the wave. And so I think somewhere between the two of those is where I tend to bounce when I'm trying to think, how on earth do we deal with just how big this is, and how primed we are to feel fear in the face of something like it. So right, it sounds cheesy, but ride the wave. One stroke at a time.
Ride the wave one stroke at a time.
Totally mixed.
Two analogies mixed together.
Yeah.
I love them both. I particularly like the one stroke at a time thing, especially when we're faced with overwhelm. And I think that's so relatable for anyone in any challenge that they face, whether that's personal, work, or on a more macro level, societal and environmental. And I like the idea that you can't see where you're going either. You just, you've got your back to it. Yeah.
Yes.
You can close your eyes. What other sport can you close your eyes?
Yes. I know.
But again, that's perhaps a nice analogy, a nice way to look at it. More broadly than pure environmentalism, though, what value do you see for athletes who engage with a purpose bigger than just that stroke?
Great. I know, I'm so glad you raised this, because it was something that Hannah and I were discussing recently and preparing a session for a group of athletes. And I think what we were both reflecting on was that in some ways we're the kind of yin and yang of what can happen in sport. I train fairly hard as I could for 2 successive games. So I was probably 2 spots short of making the Rio team, came into the Tokyo team thinking, right, I've got 4 years to practice this, and 4 years would have worked, but 5 years kaput. Hannah, it wins silver her first Olympics, gold her second, gold again her third, and just a remarkable series of feats. But for both of us, I think engaging in an issue beyond our sport has been a real anchor for the rest of life. And it really, I remember early on when I was managing that sort of entry into the intensity of being an athlete, someone trying to check me and saying, look, you've got to remember throughout this that you're a person first and an athlete second. But that's not the culture that sport at the moment really is set up to deliver. It's not the message that is most often drawn out when you're within certainly I would say the sports environments that I've been in or heard spoken about from other athletes. And so I think it really felt to us, and what we now communicate with athletes is sport is such a peculiar, other than the real rarities like equestrianism, and maybe you can help me think of a couple of others where you've got a longevity to your sports career. Most athletes are somewhat unique within society of having a guaranteed need to find alternative employment in the kind of prime of their life, when particularly for female athletes, if your sporting career is hitting in your ending in your late 20s or early 30s, you may well have other things to be thinking about, like family or relationships, or what work you want to be doing. It's a busy time of life for anybody, and so a really weird one that I don't think sport has always figured out yet about how we transition people out. And so what I think I really feel is that to have a common thread of an issue that you care about and engage with, and know that you can contribute to, can be that real anchor point, so that people don't feel adrift when a major source of their identity shifts. Because hopefully, if done right, I think sport and being an athlete should be something that you can kind of positively hold on to. And I think it's really sad when athletes, like some of my friends or acquaintances in sport, without that sort of severance of that was awful, now I'm going to have to focus on something else. What we want is people to say, I was this person who was in a sporting environment, pursuing and developing and honing these skills about being someone who's ambitious and resilient and works as part of a team and seizes opportunities and all those things. And those are the things that I'm going to continue doing, maybe in a different profession, but always with a kind of purpose running through it.
That's just a wonderful way to put it, I think, and also that sense of identity that leads to so many mental health issues for young athletes who might get rejected or injured, or older athletes who just naturally come towards the end of their career and really struggle to make that transition. I mean, I've seen it a lot, in the work that I do, working with current and ex-athletes. So it's got so much value, not just for others and for society and the world at large. Sport as a force for good, but on an individual level as well, it's got so much power.
Yeah, absolutely. Because being an athlete, sport, I don't know, maybe you disagree, but I think for many sports, sport just would not be interesting if we didn't understand the human qualities that it takes to deliver a particular result. I don't want to be controversial, but do we really care how quickly someone can get along a track in however many seconds? Maybe we do, but maybe also it's that person that is sitting behind it that we really think, Well,
I think even the athletes who do it sometimes reflect on it, and we all do it perhaps when we move from where we're so focused on achieving things, whether it is in sport or whether it's in business or whatever. We get to a point where you look back and you go, actually, what was the point of that?
Well, I know even Olympic champions who say I would feel I know as many Olympic champions that struggle with their mental health and a sense of whether it was worth it, as I know people who didn't make their Olympics, didn't get the result they wanted, didn't make the match or the team that they wanted, because if you've not had that sense of self running through it, or if you've not had the support within your team, or there are just so many aspects that go into creating an experience that an athlete would then want to celebrate and hold on to. So I think it's critical where we can that we build athletes' own sense of themselves as somebody that they are this athlete because of the person they are, and they'll always be that person. Because I think sometimes also, otherwise you end up with, I almost had a fair sense of reverse imposter syndrome once I finished my sport, because there was such a disconnect between I knew factually that I'd trained pretty much every day for 6 or 7 years to go to an Olympics that I had qualified for and had been selected for. But I then got injured and eventually kind of finished my time in the squad. And then it was like, did that even happen? I don't know whether it was like you're also so tired during all that time that things are passing you by. I don't know what it was, but it's been a process, I think, almost over the last 2 or 3 years of reconfirming to myself that I was an athlete, because I know that I've got the experiences and through that some qualities that were part of that period and that time. But otherwise, I think there's this weird split point when really that's the reverse of what sport should be achieving and creating when it brings athletes through it. Yeah.
That's so interesting. And I'm so, on the one hand, I'm sad that you never got to live everything you worked for at Tokyo, but really glad that all this came out of it, and that I'm looking forward to seeing what those qualities that drove you to be such a top athlete are gonna bring in the future.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you.
One stroke at a time.
One stroke at a time. Lunch next. That's my next stroke.